Let's start by understanding what a typical website on the internet today looks like. And it's pretty similar to this, and Cloudflare refers to this sort of website as a naked site. So that is, all the traffic that comes to that site, whether they be legitimate visitors, crawlers and bots, so things like search engines, or attackers, so those wishing to inflict harm on the website, all of this traffic currently goes to directly exposed websites. And really what we mean by that is that there's nothing sitting between these sources of traffic and the website itself. So the website has to be entirely self-sufficient when it comes to securing its content. Now the Cloudflare model does this. It drops right in the middle so that all traffic needs to go through the Cloudflare service in order to reach the site. Now inevitably what that means is that Cloudflare can implement security controls in their infrastructure. And what that means is that by the time the traffic hits your naked site, a bunch of the bad stuff gets filtered out. So in the example here, our legitimate visitors get through, and our crawlers and bots also get through. Because really we do want things like the Google search engine crawler to get to the site. That's how it gets indexed and is then searchable. But we want Cloudflare to filter out the bad stuff. So filter out the attackers before they actually get to your naked site. Now, regardless of how well you've done the security on your site, keeping malicious activity from touching it in the first place is always going to be a good thing. So the key takeaway here is that Cloudflare is going to sit in the middle of this traffic, let the good stuff through, and keep the bad stuff out. And as we progress through this course, I'll better quantify how it does that. What is good? What is bad? What levels of defense does Cloudflare have when it suspects malicious activity? Now, of course, by routing all traffic through Cloudflare's infrastructure, that is going to put another hop in the communication between the visitor and your site. So of course that begs the question, what does this do to the performance of your site? Well, to answer that, let me give you an indication of just how broad Cloudflare's service is. This is the Cloudflare global network. So this is all their points of presence around the world. So when you think about that previous diagram where we've got the traffic hitting Cloudflare before it hits your site, they've got enough points of presence closely located to such a large global audience that there's always a nearby Cloudflare endpoint. Now what that means is that whilst you might route through Cloudflare's infrastructure, we're talking about very close by infrastructure. And on top of that, there's actually a whole bunch of other really neat stuff that Cloudflare does performance-wise that will almost certainly make your site much faster than what it was before anyway. I'm only going to touch on that briefly in this course, but I'll give you some more detail on that in just a moment too. The main thing to understand now is that Cloudflare is so broadly globally distributed and growing at a very fast rate, and we'll see just how fast in a moment too, that directing traffic through their infrastructure is not going to have a negative impact on the traffic. And that's a really important thing because we don't want to achieve our greatest security by making big sacrifices on performance. Now, one of the things that Cloudflare really prides themselves on, and quite rightly too, is just how fast it takes to get set up. In fact, the whole thing from start to finish generally takes less than 5 minutes. So that's less than 5 minutes to go from that naked website that we saw just before to having Cloudflare sit in the middle and help you defend against online attacks. Now that's the initial setup, and certainly there are many more features within Cloudflare that are worth learning. So we're going to use the duration of this course to delve into those more and understand how they can help you increase the security profile of your website. Before we go on and we actually do this setup, I want to go and touch on just how quickly Cloudflare is growing and how large their global presence now is, because their scale is one of the things that helps deliver you such a fantastic service. Over recent years, Cloudflare has had absolutely astronomical growth. And a really good indication of that is the growth in monthly page views. So not only are we looking at 400 odd billion page views per month at the end of 2014, it's growing at 450% plus every year, which is just an astronomical growth rate on top of an astronomically high volume of traffic. Part of the reason that traffic is so high is that they've got such a ginormous subscriber base. So we're talking about 1.8 billion active users. To put that in context, that's the vast majority of people globally who have internet connectivity that pass through Cloudflare's assets every single month. So that is an enormously broad reach that Cloudflare currently has. Now that's just users visiting websites, but when we look at the actual number of subscriptions that Cloudflare has, they've got about 1.2 million at present. So that's a huge number of organizations and individuals using Cloudflare to host their content on the internet. And of course, that's why we see such a high number of monthly active users and monthly page views, because there are so many customers of Cloudflare these days. And as we progress through this course and you see just how easy it is to use Cloudflare's services, these figures will start to make a lot more sense. Let's just look at one more chart to give you a little bit of a sense of where Cloudflare sits on the global scale of the internet. When you look at Cloudflare compared to some of the other really large assets on the web, you get a sense of just how large they really are. Second only to Facebook in terms of monthly page views, and a heap more traffic than Google. Now that's just if we look at page views. If you change that to the monthly unique users, you're looking at double the number of people going through Cloudflare each month than what see Facebook, and a significant portion more than what see Google. And again, I'm sharing these figures here because they help you contextualize where Cloudflare sits in the global scale of internet traffic, and how it is that they're actually able to offer services like you're going to see in this course for free on such a large global scale. And it's because they have such great scale that they can make these services available to you for free. Now, as large as all these figures are, the one that really sticks out at me is this one. We don't often measure internet traffic for a single provider in the trillions, but that's where they are in terms of the number of requests they're servicing. So those 1.8 billion monthly active users loading up 400 billion pages each month are contributing to a grand total of 5 trillion web requests. And that is just an astronomically large number. So hopefully that helps you put Cloudflare in context. And now that you know just how significant they are on the global scale, let's go and actually take a look at the service that we're going to configure throughout this course. In this course, we're going to focus solely on Cloudflare's free security features. Now they do have paid plans, and of course with paid plans you get a heap of extra features. But I want to focus on the things that anybody can go out and get right now within 5 minutes for free. So everything that you see here is available without spending a cent. So for example, Cloudflare offers reputation-based threat protection. So what does this mean? Well, it means that they're able to build up a profile on the reputation of the traffic coming to your site. Based on the confidence they have in how legitimate that traffic is, they can take various actions. Let the traffic through, challenge the traffic, and we'll look at what a challenge means a little bit later on in this course, or even block the traffic outright. And it's able to do this in a very intelligent fashion because they have access to such a huge volume of traffic, and they're able to tell what is good from what is bad with a very high degree of confidence. They can do similar things with comment spam protection. Because they understand the traffic patterns that constitute comment spam, they can protect against it. And again, protecting against it doesn't necessarily mean just blocking it. It may simply mean saying, we've got a sufficient degree of confidence that this is going to be spam, that we're going to put in a validation step to establish whether it's legitimate or not. Now, regardless of how intelligent Cloudflare's threat reputation database is, you can also go in and explicitly block visitors by IP range. So if there's an individual or an organization that you want to keep out of your site, you can simply go and configure that in Cloudflare's portal. Now, not only can you configure that based on IP range, you can also even do it by country. And we're going to have a look at how to do this as we progress through the course. Now, on top of all this, Cloudflare's free security features also include basic distributed denial of service protection. And certainly DDoS attacks are something that have been increasing massively in recent years. And Cloudflare is undoubtedly one of the premier services for defending against this style of attack. So again, that's in the box for free. And finally, and frankly one of the best security features of Cloudflare, is free SSL. It's very easy to now get your entire site delivered over HTTPS, regardless of whether the upstream provider actually supports it or not. So even if your host doesn't offer SSL, or they want to charge for SSL as though it's a premium service, you can now deliver the site over a secure connection via Cloudflare absolutely for free. And in fact, after we get the site set up, that's the first thing we're going to look at. So that's Cloudflare Security. This isn't exhaustive either. We're going to see a lot more detail as we progress through the course. But along with security, the other thing that Cloudflare prides itself on, and does do extremely well, is performance. And although we're not going to delve into performance in this course, I want to give you just a quick snapshot of what you do get for free with this Cloudflare service. The thing about having such a broad, globally distributed network as Cloudflare has is it does allow them to do fantastic things performance-wise, because they've got all of these edge presences that are close enough to such huge percentages of the audience of your website. So that alone allows them to do some pretty amazing things with CDNs. But then because your traffic goes through Cloudflare's infrastructure, they can also optimize that traffic. And there are a huge range of optimizations that can be performed by Cloudflare when that traffic passes out through their network. So again, not something we're going to delve into in this course, but I do want to make it clear that performance is another real strength of the Cloudflare service. So with all this understood, let's summarize the module and then we'll move on and actually start setting up the service. Let's summarize the module. And one of the fundamentals I got across very early was that Cloudflare's model does involve routing your traffic through their infrastructure. In fact, all of these security and performance features are predicated by the fact that they are going to secure and optimize your traffic. Now that's okay when their global network is so vast and they can spread those endpoints all out over the globe so that they're close to where the audience is. So what all this means is that you shouldn't be suffering a performance hit for your site even though traffic is routing through their network. In fact, it should be going the other way. You should be getting a performance gain because of the sorts of features we saw earlier in terms of how they can optimize the traffic. And of course, all of this is possible because of that ginormous scale. Their mammoth size means they've got the economies of scale to be able to offer the features that you're going to see in this course absolutely for free. And what's more, we'll be able to get it set up in less than 5 minutes. So let's go and do that now. Let's get it set up and then we'll spend the rest of the course talking about how the features actually work and how you can optimize them to better protect your otherwise naked website. If you're familiar with my other Pluralsight courses, you may have seen this site before. So this is the site originally featured in my Hack Yourself First course. It's a site called Supercar Showdown, which is a website where you can go and vote for the supercars that you like. Unfortunately, it is full of security holes. Now you'll see that this site is currently on the domain cloudflareonazure.com. I want to make it really clear, this is not Cloudflare's domain, it's not Microsoft Azure's domain, it's a custom domain that I have registered in order to demonstrate how Cloudflare does work on an Azure website. Now having said that, nothing that I'm about to show you is specific to Microsoft's Azure cloud platform. This could be any website, doesn't matter. Cloudflare will play nice with pretty much anything. Now what we're going to do in this course is get this domain routing through Cloudflare's infrastructure. The site is also available on another domain, and in fact this is the one that you might recognize from my other courses. hackyourselffirst.troyhunt.com is exactly the same site as Cloudflare on Azure.com. It's actually the same website, it's not just the same code. Both domains are currently bound to the same website. Now we're just going to take that Cloudflare on Azure.com domain and route that through Cloudflare. So we'll be able to come back and actually compare how Cloudflare's service looks compared to loading the site direct from Azure. Now one of the really important features of Cloudflare is the fact that you can get SSL for free. So loading sites over an encrypted connection is becoming increasingly important, and in many cases SSL does remain a premium service. And I say premium in that it's not available unless you pay more money. And that's the case even in a service like Azure. So for example, you can get a shared Azure website and pay single dollar figures per month, but you can't get HTTPS. If you want that, you've got to go to a basic or standard website and start paying many tens of dollars per month. That might not sound like a lot of money, but for some people, that actually makes the service unobtainable. So that's going to be our scenario here. We have the site, but we don't have SSL, and we want to be able to load this site over HTTPS for free. Now let's take a look at what happens if we try and do that now. I'm going to jump up into the address bar, and I'm going to change the scheme to HTTPS. Chrome is not exactly subtle when there is a certificate problem. And in fact, it's telling us that attackers might be trying to steal our information. Now we're going to do exactly what we tell consumers never to do, which is ignore the error message. And we're going to proceed to Cloudflare on Azure.com in an unsafe fashion. Now when we do this, we see the same site, but clearly the HTTPS in the scheme has got a great big red line through it, and our padlock has got a red cross. This is never what we want to show a consumer. But I'm showing you here because I want to now take a look at the certificate. So we'll jump up to the padlock and we'll see a message here about the server's certificate not matching the URL. So let's jump in and actually have a look at the certificate information and see why that might be. And what we can now see is that we've actually been given a certificate that was issued to star.azurewebsites.net. Now the reason we see this is that every time you create a website on Azure, Microsoft has a wildcard certificate that will allow you to load the website over HTTPS, but so long as it's on the azurewebsites.net domain. So that's great for testing, but it's obviously not the way you want to stand up a live website. Now when we don't have a valid certificate for the domain on the website, we get this default Azure one. So this is the scenario that we're going to play through in this course. We've got a website, it's got a domain, there's a certificate on it, but it's not valid for the domain. Now the site doesn't have to have a certificate to use Cloudflare Security Services, and I'll talk about that more in the next module on SSL, but when there is one, it does allow us to strengthen the implementation just a little bit. So that's the scenario that we're going to use in this module. Let's now leave this site, jump over to Cloudflare, and start configuring things. So here we are on Cloudflare's website. I've already got an account. It's easy enough for you to set that up. I'm not going to walk you through just filling out a form. And the first thing I see when I log onto my account is the ability to add a website. Now I don't have any websites in Cloudflare at all at the moment. So what I want to do now is add a new one. And we're going to do this by adding a domain. And that domain is going to be our Cloudflare on Azure.com domain that we just saw the Supercar Showdown website on. So I'm going to enter that here. And now I'm going to click Scan DNS Records. So here's what's happening now. If you have audio, you will hear Cloudflare playing a video to you, which explains what it's doing. But in short, it's going off and pulling the DNS records for this website. Because what we're going to need to do is set up Cloudflare to handle all our DNS. So after this process completes, it's going to want us to change our name servers from whoever they are at the moment, and you'll see mine shortly, and use Cloudflare's instead. Now before doing that, Cloudflare is going to get all the right DNS records in place so that when we update those name servers, it's going to be just a seamless rollover. Now by handling DNS, Cloudflare is going to be able to route traffic to the right endpoints. And to use this service, you do need to hand over control of DNS to them. You can't continue to use your own provider. So that's a pretty key point. Do be conscious of that before you start down this process, just in case there are reasons why you don't want to change your DNS provider. So after about a minute, Cloudflare finishes the intro video, finishes scanning for your DNS settings, and allows you to continue. So let's go and do that now. We've got 4 DNS records. So the A record here, Cloudflare on Azure.com, is currently pointing to the IP beginning with 137. So that's the Microsoft Azure IP. Now what the little status icon there is telling us is that this is going to be updated to route traffic through Cloudflare's infrastructure. Same with the www CNAME. So whether it's the naked domain or the www prefix, it's going to route through Cloudflare and then continue on to our Azure website. Now Cloudflare has also added an MX record here for mail, and I don't particularly want that. So I'm just going to delete that record and confirm. And then the TXT record down here. I used this originally to verify my domain before binding it to my Azure website. And in fact, as you can see here, it's an alias for the hackyourselffirst.azurewebsites.net domain. This was just purely Azure setup, and I don't need it now that I'm going to be on Cloudflare. So I'm just going to delete that and confirm, and that's it. My DNS records are now fine. So let's go and continue with this, and now we'll be prompted to select a plan. We're going to go with free. Everything we do in this course is going to be free, and it's defaulted to that anyway, which is fantastic. So let's just continue through there, and now we get to the point about name servers. So presently, I'm using DNSimple to not only manage my domain, but I'm also using their name servers. And you can see the 4 records I've got here down the left-hand side of the screen. Now what Cloudflare wants me to do is to use 2 of their name servers. And comically, their name servers are actually names. We've got Leah and Rob. So we're going to use those 2 guys, and we don't need name server 3 and 4. But to make this work, I'm going to need to jump over to DNSimple and make these changes because they're going to remain my domain registrar. I just want to use different name servers. So let's move on and we'll go and make that change now. I'm now over on DNSimple, and these are the guys that manage all of my domain things, including normally managing my name servers and consequently my DNS. Now I'm going to have to update this to Cloudflare's name servers. But before I do this, I want to make a really important point. If you do this with your website and you presently have SSL on your existing website, go and watch the next module as well before you make this change. You can break stuff doing this. So DNS is something that you always have to be really cautious with if you want to have zero downtime. So again, if you've got SSL already, watch the next module first and then make this change. Now in my case, as we saw before, I have no SSL at the moment. So all I'm going to do is make the changes to the name servers. So just recapping, if we look back at the Cloudflare site, we need to have 2 name servers, leah.ns.cloudflare.com and rob.ns.cloudflare.com. So let's make that change now. I'm going to go down to change name servers. And of course, the way you do this will differ based on your domain registrar of choice. And I'm going to set my primary name server to Leah. I'm going to set the next name server to Rob. And I'm going to delete name servers 3 and 4 because we're not going to use the DNSimple ones anymore. So with that done, let's now change the name servers. Now the really important thing to remember here is that when you make this change, name resolution, so when someone types in your domain name, is going to transition from your existing registrar, so D and Simple in my case, to Cloudflare. So Cloudflare is about to be in control of routing my traffic. So this is the end of that less than 5-minute setup they talk about. All we've done is entered the domain, confirmed our records, and then changed the name servers. So it's really just those 3 steps. Once this is done, we are done. But of course, the thing with DNS is that it does take a while to propagate as well. So we've made the changes, and that's great. But let's now actually go and test it and see if the DNS is working properly. We want to see how our DNS propagation is going, because really the key to rolling over to Cloudflare is actually routing the traffic through their infrastructure. So we want that cloudflareonazure.com domain name to start pointing to their name servers and route through their gateways before it lands on my Azure website. Now there's a great site for checking how DNS propagation is going. It's this one just here, and I've entered in the domain name here, cloudflareonazure.com, and I've done a search, and what we're seeing here is DNS servers all around the globe telling us what IP address that name is resolving to. And in fact, what we can see is that every single DNS server is already resolving to this IP address that starts with 104. That's Cloudflare. And in fact, what it's telling us is that the DNS change is already propagated out. Now, DNS propagation can be a bit unpredictable, and the general safe rule of thumb is that it can take up to 24 hours. So keep in mind what that means here is that for up to a day, you might have some visitors going through the Cloudflare infrastructure, whilst other visitors are still going direct to your naked website. So keep that in mind. What I want to check though is what my DNS is resolving to. So if I load my website in the browser, am I going to get the naked site based on the old DNS records, or the site served through Cloudflare based on the updated DNS records? So let me jump over to a command prompt and we'll run a bit of NS lookup just to check what's happening. So here's my command prompt. Let's do this. I'm going to run NS lookup cloudflareonazure.com. Let's see what that gives us. So here's what we see. I'm using Google's DNS. That's the one at 8.8.8.8, and it's telling us that cloudflareonazure.com is presently resolving to the IP address that starts with 104. And again, this is Cloudflare's IP address, so the DNS has taken effect on my machine. Now, if I was to see the 137 IP address, which we saw just before when Cloudflare was showing us the existing records, I'd know it was still pointing at Azure. So I wouldn't want to spend too much time trying to test that my Cloudflare configuration was working properly. Now do this. Do check that your DNS is resolving to where you think it is before you start investing effort trying to see how the site is now behaving. Many people have blown many hours simply because name records are not pointing to where they think they are. So check this first. Now that we've established this though, let's jump over to the browser, reload the site, and we'll see what it looks like. So back in the browser, and we know that Google's DNS is now correct, but I also want to make sure that Chrome is not caching any DNS records itself. It has its own host cache. So just to be extra sure, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab a new tab, and I'm going to run chrome://net-internals/#DNS. Now what that's going to allow us to do is now clear the host cache. So that should give us a clean slate to work with. So let me now close this tab, and what we want to do now is actually load up our site. So here it is, and it certainly looks like the site did before. No problems there. How do we know if this is actually being served from Cloudflare? Well, we think that the DNS is right, but there is another little trick we can use just to find out. If I press Ctrl+U to view the page source, we'll now see that we've actually got a bit of script in here from Cloudflare. Now there's two really important things I want to point out here. Number one is that clearly our traffic is now routing through Cloudflare. So good news there. Number 2 is that Cloudflare is actually modifying our traffic. Now, of course, we're entrusting Cloudflare with the traffic. They now control it. They can make modifications. And that's the point I want to make. By using this service, you are trusting Cloudflare with your traffic. Now, they are very trustworthy. I don't have any problems with that. But you have to be aware that effectively Cloudflare is now a man in the middle of your traffic. Every request and every response is going to go through their infrastructure, and they have the ability to change it. Now, that is actually a key part of their service offering. They can change it. They can make it more secure. They can make it faster. I'm making the point here simply to ensure that you're aware of their role between your audience and your website. Now, if you don't want this modification, you can always just go and turn off the Smart Errors feature, which is what added this in. So you can certainly disable it if you don't want it. So that's it. We've now got this set up. We've now got it testing. It's working beautifully. Let's summarize the module, and then we'll move on and have a look at how the SSL is working and how we can strengthen it a bit too. Let's summarize the module. And the first thing that I hope is now very, very abundantly clear is that this really did just take a few minutes. Actually using the Cloudflare service on your existing site is dead simple. So all we had to do was just go and enter the domain, let Cloudflare find your existing DNS settings, and then simply jump over to your registrar and update the name servers to use Cloudflare's instead. That was it. It was simply then just a matter of waiting for DNS to do its thing. And once you are confident that your traffic is being routed through Cloudflare's infrastructure, just jump into the page source and make sure they've added their little piece of script, which should be final confirmation that your site is now being loaded through Cloudflare's infrastructure. Now that we've done that, we can go and start looking at the security features. So let's move on and have a look at what it means to get SSL for free from Cloudflare and how we can configure it to make it even stronger. We'll have a look at the overview of how SSL works on Cloudflare in just a moment, but I wanted to start here on the Azure web app page because it has this matrix of what features you get for each tier of the service. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is that I want to contextualize the point I've made a few times now about SSL being viewed as a premium service. Now, I'm using Azure as an example here because it's where I have all my websites, but certainly Microsoft's approach here is very consistent with what you'll see throughout the industry at the time of recording. And that is simply that you don't always get SSL certificates on the lower tiers of their offerings. And in fact, even as you go up through the higher tiers of service and SSL becomes available, sometimes it comes with a cost and other times it comes with a limit on how many sites you can actually apply SSL to. So this is really what I mean by premium service. It's still a feature which hosting operators can charge money for. It is not something that you just get by default everywhere. Now, that is something that's changing pretty rapidly in the industry as we recognize that all internet traffic deserves encryption. But it again reiterates the value proposition of Cloudflare. And in fact, using Cloudflare and a service like Azure together gets you the best of both worlds. You get an absolutely fantastic hosting platform and you get SSL for free on top of it. As well, of course, as all the performance enhancements you get when you use the Cloudflare service. So it's a very good match, and it does highlight this point about SSL being a premium service. With that now understood, let's move on and have a look at how it actually works on Cloudflare. Here's a really, really simple picture. You have a visitor, they go to your site, you've got no SSL. Now, what does it mean not having SSL? Well, the obvious thing is it means that your traffic isn't encrypted. So eavesdroppers could watch what's going on in that network communication. If you had what we typically refer to as a man-in-the-middle attack, you'd have a confidentiality risk. The traffic could be observed. But you also don't have integrity. And what I mean by that is that a man in the middle could manipulate the content. They could, for example, change the action of a form such that when someone logs on with their credentials, it posts it to another server. You can't trust something that isn't loaded over an HTTPS connection. The other thing is that you don't have confidence in the authenticity of the site you're visiting. You see a domain name, you see an HTTP connection, but you don't know whether the site that's being loaded is the legitimate site or not, because it doesn't have to present a certificate to verify itself. So these are all the sorts of reasons why people want to get SSL on their site. So let's go and have a look at what this now looks like with Cloudflare in the middle. So here's how things change. We've now got Cloudflare sitting between the visitor and your site. Now there are a couple of really key things I want to point out here. One is that the visitor is seeing HTTPS in the address bar and they're seeing a certificate that they can inspect. And we'll go and have a look at that in just a moment. So for all intents and purposes, the visitor is seeing a secure connection. What is really important to remember though, is that the way we have just set this site up means that Cloudflare is then talking to my site in the clear. So what I mean by that is that it's an HTTP connection. Even though the visitor is seeing HTTPS in the address bar, they are not getting an encrypted connection all the way through to the origin. So through to that original site running on Azure. Now there are ways that we can strengthen this implementation, and that's one of the things that we're going to do in this module. But you do need to be conscious of just how significant this is. And really, this demonstrates how important the rest of this module is going to be, because it will help you secure this part of the connection and make it crystal clear what parts of the transport layer are encrypted, what parts are not, and where your risk lies in each of these network segments. So now that we've covered that, and you know what the status quo is right now, let's move on and actually start testing this site over an HTTPS connection and seeing how it behaves. This is the home page for my site configuration on Cloudflare. So we can see the name here, cloudflareonazure.com, and I can see that the status is active. Now, one thing to be conscious of is that when you do first update the name servers with your registrar, you won't necessarily see this status being active. You may see it as being pending, and that's because DNS propagation can take a while. And obviously that's something that we discussed in the last module. So do be conscious of where this status is at when you're doing your testing. What I want to do now though is jump over to the section here on crypto, because this is where our SSL is configured. Now what you'll see here in the SSL configuration section is that it's currently flexible, and we'll look at the other options in there shortly, and the certificate is active. Now one thing about Cloudflare's free SSL implementation is that it can take up to 24 hours for the certificate to be activated. This is why in the previous module I said make sure you watch the module on SSL before you actually update your name servers, because what you don't want is to set up the Cloudflare service, update your name servers, and DNS starts propagating immediately, but then your certificate isn't active for up to 24 hours. Because if that happens, you do risk killing any HTTPS connections that people are making. So the really important point here is that if you're using SSL already on your website before you roll over to Cloudflare, make sure that you're seeing this green active certificate status before you make changes to your name servers. That is absolutely critical if you don't want to lose traffic. Fortunately though, we've already gone green, so let's now go and load our site over HTTPS. So I'm going to grab a new tab and go to https://cloudflareonazure.com. Let's now load that up. And here we go. We're now seeing the site over HTTPS. Green padlock, green explicit HTTPS in the address bar. Everything looks fine. Let's go and have a look at the certificate that Cloudflare has given us. We'll take a look at the Connection tab, and here we can see that your connection to Cloudflare on Azure.com is encrypted with modern cryptography. And in fact, we're using TLS 1.2 as well, which is the latest and greatest version of transport layer security today. Now up a little bit, we can see that the website has been verified by Komodo. Let's go and take a look at that certificate. And here we can see that it has been issued to Cloudflare and it's been issued by Komodo. Now that certificate is valid from when I requested it today through to almost another year from now. And one of the great things about using Cloudflare for your SSL is that they will take care of the certificate renewal for you. So normally on a regular cycle, you'd have to go and renew the certificate and load the new one into your site. Cloudflare does that for you as part of the service. So that's great. This site now looks like it's running fantastically over a secure connection. But of course, one of the things with SSL is that there are degrees of SSL. Not all SSL is equal. So let's go and run a quick test on this site and see how well Cloudflare's SSL actually stacks up. This is a fantastic site for testing the strength of an SSL implementation. It's provided by Qualys and it's called SSL Labs. And all I'm going to do in here is enter the domain name of our site and get it to go away and test it. So we'll plug in cloudflareonazure.com and submit. Now what the Qualys service is going to do is go away and test a whole bunch of different aspects of our implementation. And that can actually take a while. So I'm going to let it run for a few minutes and then we'll come back and check the results. So here's the result. And the good news is we've got a grade A. You can see it's actually tested 2 different IP addresses behind the domain. We're just going to jump into the first one and have a look at why it actually gets an A. So let's drill down into this IP and we'll scroll down a little bit and just have a look at this summary. Now these reports are quite lengthy. The SSL Labs test does go into a lot of detail, so you can always go and have a look at this detail on your own site a little bit later. There are a couple of things I want to point out here though. So one is that even though we have an A grade, you'll see that we could have gone just a little bit higher on protocol support and then a little bit higher again on key exchange and cipher strength. So we've scored 100, 95, 90, 90. We're going to come back to this a little bit later on after we strengthen the implementation further and see if we can actually get that A grade even higher. The other thing that I'll point out here is the section in light blue here. This site works only in browsers with SNI support. Now SNI is server name indication, and it's an alternative to the way we used to always stand up SSL, which was an IP-based SSL, where you had to have an IP address for each certificate. Now SNI works fantastically in almost everything, but do be a little bit conscious that there are some legacy browser and operating system combinations that this won't work on. So for example, Internet Explorer 8 on Windows XP cannot work with SNI SSL. Now even at the time of recording, that combination is almost non-existent, but there are still some cases where it needs to be supported. So do make sure that you're very clear about the audience you need to support before you commit to SNI SSL. So this is great. Right out of the box, we have a nice, strong SSL implementation. So now that we understand how things work by default, let's go and have a look at some of the other options for how we can configure our SSL on Cloudflare. When you use Cloudflare's free SSL service, there are actually several different possible implementations of it. And the first one I want to talk about is the one that you get by default, and that's called Flexible SSL. So it looks like this. You have your visitor and your site, and you have Cloudflare in the middle, and the visitor to Cloudflare connection is encrypted. But as I mentioned earlier in this module, the Cloudflare to your site connection is not encrypted. Now what that means is that you do not have transport layer encryption all the way through to the origin. there's a segment of network there where the traffic goes in the clear. And shortly, I'll show you the risk that that represents. So that's flexible. The next option we have in terms of strengthening the implementation is called full SSL. Now, when we have full SSL, Cloudflare is going to make an encrypted connection to the site. Now, there are a couple of things about this. So number one is that Cloudflare then expects your site to serve an SSL certificate. But the thing about full SSL is Cloudflare won't validate the certificate. It doesn't have to be a valid certificate for the site that Cloudflare is talking to. So this has the upside of being able to issue a self-signed certificate on the site, so it won't actually be validated against a certificate authority. And it has the downside of not actually being able to ensure the authenticity of your site because the certificate doesn't have to be valid. Now that's where the next level of SSL comes in. So this is full SSL strict. And what Cloudflare is going to do now is say that your site does actually have to serve a valid SSL certificate. So it is going to do the whole certificate authority validation handshake. Now that's going to mean that you do have end-to-end encryption, but Cloudflare is still effectively going to be man-in-the-middling you. So it's going to communicate to your site, decrypt the communication, and then encrypt it before it sends it on to the visitor. So the transport layer itself is going to be encrypted. There's just going to be a node in the middle where encryption and decryption happens. Now this does present somewhat of a paradox, because for many people, they're going to Cloudflare in order to get SSL for free. And if they're needing SSL for free, then they're not going to be able to do full SSL strict because they won't already have SSL on their website. They may be able to do full SSL, which is that there could be a certificate on their website, but it's not valid. And this is what we saw earlier on in the course when I tried to load the original Cloudflare on Azure.com website and I got the star.azurewebsites.net certificate. So that's going to be a possibility for some. But for many people, they're simply going to have no SSL on the origin, which means using that first option, flexible SSL, the default. But what does that really mean in terms of risks? So what happens when that network segment between Cloudflare and the origin, that being your site, what happens when that's not encrypted? Let's go take a look at what risks exist in which network segments. So let's look purely at the two network segments. So the one between the visitor and Cloudflare, and the one between Cloudflare and the origin site. And I want to talk about the different risks that we see in each one of these network segments. Now I'll give you a couple of examples in each. So one of the transport layer risks that we face is a visitor jumping onto a rogue Wi-Fi network. Now what do I mean by rogue? Well, it could be that the free cafe Wi-Fi they've connected to is actually saving all the packets that go backwards and forwards. It could be that someone has deliberately stood up a malicious Wi-Fi network and perhaps just called it free Wi-Fi, so people jump onto it and then have their traffic intercepted. It could even be a more malicious style of attack using a device such as a Wi-Fi pineapple, which actually tricks a client into connecting to it without the user consciously performing any action. Their phone just suddenly connects to the pineapple and starts sending all the traffic through it. So Wi-Fi is actually a very, very good use case for SSL. Another good example is DNS hijacking. So we've seen many attacks in the past where the DNS settings on devices such as routers or PCs are hijacked such that the name resolution is pointed to another server. The client is connecting to a name that it trusts, but that traffic is being routed through to an attacker's server. Now this goes to the earlier point I made about the authenticity aspect of SSL. And in both these cases, both the rogue Wi-Fi and the DNS hijacking, if the connection is made over HTTPS and a valid certificate doesn't exist, doesn't matter if it's a certificate directly on your website or on the Cloudflare service, the connection will be dropped. And this is a really significant value proposition of SSL. Now let's look at the other segment. So what's the risk between Cloudflare and the origin? Well, one is that Cloudflare is inevitably going to have to go over public networks. So when I make a request to the website that I just set up on Cloudflare, that request is going to them, and then they're making an HTTP request to the origin website, and that is going over public networks. So what that means is that the network providers have access to the clear traffic. The other party that inevitably has access to that sort of traffic is governments. And certainly we now know that governments are very adept at siphoning up traffic on the internet backbone. But I do want to take a rather practical, objective look at this though, because the reality of it is, for the vast majority of websites, the risks are over here on the left. So between the user and Cloudflare. It's the local network risks. It's the compromised device risk that hijacks DNS. It's things in the immediate vicinity between the user's device and their ISP that in most cases pose the greatest risk. Now that's not to downplay the risk that can exist between Cloudflare and the site, but it's usually a very specific type of website that's attractive to, say, a government, in terms of them actively wanting to compromise the traffic. So there's two really important points I want to make here. One is that simply seeing HTTPS in the address bar does not mean that the traffic has gone all the way to the origin website securely. It's great that end users can see HTTPS, but it doesn't always mean what they think it might mean. But the other point I want to make is that that is a vast improvement over an HTTP-only connection. I would prefer any day to see my traffic secure between me and the Cloudflare network, and then not secure between Cloudflare and the origin, than what I would to see it open everywhere, because the vast majority of the time that is going to be vastly more secure than no HTTPS at all. So now that we understand that, let's actually go and configure it in Cloudflare and see how we can strengthen that HTTPS implementation. So here's what I want to do now. I want to run through the other SSL options that we've got here in this drop-down list. And now that we understand what full and strict do, I want to actually start by going all the way to strict. So this is going to want to validate the certificate at the other end. Now you would have noticed that as soon as I changed that, we got a little loading indicator on the right-hand side. So there's no save button. Once the selected item changes in that list, it gets applied immediately. So remember, what strict is going to do is it's going to expect a valid certificate from the origin. Now that we've changed that, let's jump back over to our website and we'll reload the page. Now we can see there is a problem, invalid SSL certificate, and it gives us a nice little network diagram here too. We can see me, my browser is working. We can see Cloudflare in Sydney is working. So there I am hitting my local Cloudflare edge, but we can see a host error, and it does actually tell us beneath that big error message, invalid SSL certificate. We can't use strict SSL on this website because my Azure site can't serve a valid certificate for the domain. So let's jump back over to Cloudflare for a moment, and what we're going to do is change strict just down to full, and we'll let that save. So now it should try to create an SSL connection to the origin, but it won't be validating the certificate. So it won't matter if my origin website actually serves up a certificate for Azure Websites.net. Let's go and reload the page and we'll check that that actually works. And here we have our site back again. So effectively we've found some middle ground. We do have SSL between Cloudflare and my Azure website, but it's not validating the certificate. So it does certainly still represent a risk, but it's better than no SSL at all. Now, as I said before, it would be great if I actually had a valid certificate on the origin website, but much of the value proposition of this free Cloudflare service is that you don't need it. So that's the paradox of strengthening the SSL implementation. But there are other things we can do to make this SSL stronger than what the default is. So let's move on and have a look at how we can start forcing HTTPS across the entire site. So here's our site at present, loaded over HTTPS working beautifully. But what it means is that we still can do this. So I can go up here to the scheme, I can change it to HTTP, and I can request the site insecurely over the unencrypted scheme. Now for many sites, going HTTPS means always going HTTPS. You now want to load everything over the secure connection. And that's in scenarios both where someone might just type in the domain name itself into the browser and it defaults to HTTP, or explicitly enters HTTP. So in either of those scenarios, or where you might still have legacy links through to the site in HTTP, you may actually want to redirect people so that they get the more secure version. So let's jump back over to Cloudflare and force all of our HTTP requests to be redirected to HTTPS. So we'll jump in. So I'm going to go over to page rules. And what page rules are going to allow us to do is to create that rule. Now I'm going to make this really easy. I'm going to have a URL pattern. So I'm going to use the / wildcard. So every path on this site, I always want to use HTTPS. And that's all we're going to do. As soon as we set always use HTTPS on, all the other options disappear and we simply add the rule. So now that we've added that rule, let's jump back over to the website and we'll reload the HTTP version. And what we can see now is it has actually redirected. Let's do this again. And this time I want to see what's actually happening. So I'm going to press F12 to open up the developer tools. We'll go to network and I'm going to change this scheme again back to HTTP, request it, and then what we can see down here in our network requests is the first request results in a 301, and that then redirects the browser to the second request, which is going to be our HTTPS request. So a 301 is a permanent redirect. So effectively what we've just done is made one request that results in a 301, and that 301 is a permanent redirect. So it's telling the browser that the content should always be in the new location. And that of course has resulted in the content being loaded securely. So that's a really, really easy thing to do. Page rule with a wildcard to take every request and then permanently redirect it to the secure version. But there's also another way that we can force HTTPS on every request. And in fact, in some ways, that's even more powerful. And that's by using HSTS. HTTP Strict Transport Security, or more commonly known as HSTS. Now this is just a simple browser response header, and that header looks like this: Strict Transport Security. Now what happens when the browser gets this response header is it's going to force the browser to make HTTPS requests in the future. And the way it does this is by defining an expiry. And what that expiry says is we're going to set a max age, and this max age here in seconds equates to a year. And then we're also going to include subdomains in that response header, which looks like this. And that is going to mean that every single subsequent request that the browser makes to either the domain or a subdomain of that domain within the next year is going to be forcibly made over HTTPS. So no more 301, where the browser still makes an insecure request that can be intercepted. It's just going to be HTTPS from the outset. Now you can make this even more secure again by preloading it. And what this preload option does is says that the browser can actually have this hard-coded into it. So Google can hard-code this HSTS rule into Chrome. You still need to go and submit this to Google, and there's no guarantee that they're actually going to add it, but this does say that you're happy for it to be preloaded into the browser. So if you take the position that you only ever want your site to be loaded over HTTPS, then using HSTS and preloading it is a pretty powerful thing to do. It's also really easy to set up in Cloudflare. So let's jump back to the browser and do that now. So here we are back on the crypto page on the Cloudflare portal. And you can see here that we have a little Enable HSTS button. So let's jump into that and we get this modal with a bunch of warnings. Now, the reason why you've got warnings here is that once you enable HSTS and a browser has loaded your website over a secure connection and gotten that HSTS header, it will always try and load your site over HTTPS, at least until it reaches that max age definition in the header. Now, the problem with this is that if you then decide to only serve your site over HTTP and no longer support the HTTPS scheme, the site will break because there'll be no response from the HTTPS request. So this is something that you only turn on when you're absolutely confident that you're always going to serve your site over HTTPS. Because short of manually removing the HSTS rule for this site from the browser, and then everyone who's visited your site would have to do that, there's no way to remove it once you stop serving HTTPS. So I'm actually fine with all that. I'm going to check I understand, and I'm going to continue to the next step. Now we have a few options here. And the first one is, yes, we do actually want to enable HSTS. We're going to set that max age header to as long as we can possibly go, and Cloudflare gives us up to 6 months. I'm going to include subdomains, not that I have any at present, but if I did, I'd want them all to be served securely as well. And do note the caution here again. If you create a subdomain and maybe host it somewhere entirely different, but host it over HTTP, this is going to cause you real problems. And I'm also going to check the option here that allows browsers to preload it. So let's now save those settings. And what I want to do now is jump over to the browser. It's already got the page loaded over HTTPS and it's already got the network tools open. I'm going to reload the page. So it's going to reload over HTTPS, and you do need a response over HTTPS in order to set that HSTS header. And now I'm going to look at that response because I want to see if the header's there. And here it is. We can see it down here at the bottom of the response headers. Strict transport security. There's the max age. There's include subdomains. There's preload. So Chrome has now been told that it is no longer allowed to load this website over HTTP. So let's have a look at what happens if we try and do that. I'm going to go up and explicitly change the scheme from HTTPS to HTTP, try and load the page, and now let's look at the network requests. So remember, after we set up the page rule to force all requests to HTTPS, the browser did actually make an HTTP request and the site responded with a 301. Now what's happened this time is that the very first request is actually a 307. And the 307 is an internal redirect. And what that actually means is that Chrome never made a request to the site over HTTP. It got redirected before it could even do that. So the 307 caused Chrome's very first network request to be over HTTPS. So this now gives us a very secure position. Between the page rule and HSTS, we've now said that even if the browser is able to make an HTTP request to the site, so say it's the very first time someone ever goes there, that request will be insecure, but it will immediately get redirected over HTTPS, the response will have an HSTS header, and the browser will never be able to make an insecure request again. At least not until it hits that max age, and then the very next request will repeat the process. So this is a really nice secure position. In fact, it's so secure, I want to show you what this has done to our SSL Labs report. So I've just gone and rerun this SSL Labs report, and you can see that we now have an A+. And per the message down the bottom of the screen, this server supports HTTP strict transport security with long duration, grade set to A+. It hasn't actually changed any of the individual ratings in the graph, but it has strengthened our overall position. So this is now an A+ SSL implementation, and it's absolutely free, and it just took a few minutes to configure. And that is a fantastic security position for your website. Let's summarize the module. And one of the first things we saw was that the default SSL implementation really is pretty good. We got an A grade on the SSL Labs test, and it couldn't have been easier to set up. But you do need to understand what is encrypted and what is not. It's going to get your encryption from the client to Cloudflare, but by default, Cloudflare is not going to communicate securely with the origin server. Now, in order to strengthen that communication, we looked at full SSL and strict SSL. The former gave us encryption but no validation, and the latter actually validated the certificate at the origin. So you want to move as far along this spectrum as you can, preferably to strict. But of course, many people are coming to the free Cloudflare service because they didn't have a valid SSL certificate in the first place. So that may simply not be an option. But again, be pragmatic, be objective, consider where this makes sense and where the risk remains. Regardless of the implementation, you can easily strengthen things, both with page rules to force an HTTP request to be redirected by Cloudflare to HTTPS, and then you can go all the way to using HTTP Strict Transport Security, or HSTS, and then the browser will never be able to make an insecure request again, at least not until it hits that max age and the header is set again on the next secure request. Remember also that once we turn that on, we went all the way to an A+ grade on the SSL Labs report. That's as high as you can go. Fantastic result. So this is a really great way of getting free SSL on the website as securely as your origin website allows, and we demonstrated that it really is a class-leading SSL implementation between the client and Cloudflare. As we progress through this module, you're going to see the word threats used a lot. And a really important concept within Cloudflare is the threat score. And this is a score that gets assigned to the traffic so Cloudflare can figure out how to treat it. Now, the threat score is calculated based on sources such as Project Honeypot, which is a free distributed open source project designed to classify web traffic, particularly when it comes to things like tracking spammers. Now, Cloudflare is intelligent enough to use sources such as this, along with other attributes of the traffic, to establish how trustworthy the request is. Now, in establishing trust, one of the things that Cloudflare can do is offset that threat score by asking the client to answer a challenge. And we're going to see this challenge a few times throughout this module. And effectively, what we're doing is saying, hey, this traffic has a threat score sufficient to be a little bit suspicious about it. Can we improve that score by offering this challenge, which gives them a greater confidence that the traffic isn't malicious? Now, one of the great things about routing 5 trillion requests through your infrastructure each month is that Cloudflare learns a lot from this behavior. It doesn't matter if your site doesn't have a lot of traffic through it. The fact that Cloudflare handles the traffic from such a significant portion of the internet means that they see an absolutely ginormous number of threats. They've got huge sources of data from which they can establish what is good traffic versus what is bad traffic. And they can learn from that behavior and apply it to your traffic going through your site. So let's look at how Cloudflare can then respond once it actually understands the threat score of the traffic. There are a few different things that Cloudflare can do in response to a request that comes through its infrastructure. Now, the obvious one is it can just allow the traffic. Let the request go through and let the website respond just as you'd normally expect it to. Another thing it can do is challenge. And when I say challenge, I mean present the user, so the origin of the traffic, with a page that forces them to identify that, yes, they are indeed human and it is normal internet traffic. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. The other thing Cloudflare can do is present an interstitial page. So this is effectively a page in between the user and the actual page they want to get to. And this interstitial page is used to establish whether the traffic is legitimate or not. And if everything checks out, the user will simply be directed to the original page they wanted. So it just becomes one little intermediary step along the way. We'll see what that looks like in a moment too. And the final thing that Cloudflare can do is just outright block the request. So if they've got a high enough degree of confidence that the request is malicious, or if you configure the firewall to explicitly block the request, and we'll have a look at a couple of different ways that you can do that in just a moment, then Cloudflare simply won't serve the resource. So we're going to see all these 4 types of responses over the remainder of this module. Let's move on now and have a look at how we can set the security level of the site using the firewall feature in the Cloudflare control panel. So back on Cloudflare, let's now go into the firewall section in the navigation. And the first thing you'll see here is the security level. And as per the description, we can customize this security level such that we can determine who should receive the challenge page. So this is the page that forces you to prove that you're a human and not some sort of automated process. Now by default, this is set to medium. But as you can see here, we can go down to high and we can go down to I'm under attack. And as we scale the security on the firewall up, lower and lower threat scores will receive the challenge. Now, of course, the risk you have here is false positives because you don't want legitimate users being challenged. That's a terrible user experience. And as you'll see in a moment, as good as the challenge is at actually verifying whether the traffic is automated or legitimate, it is not a pleasant user experience at all. So this is something you want to be very cautious with. Now, I want to give you an example of how this works. We've been loading the website in the browser and everything has worked fine. We've never seen a challenge. And certainly this has just been very honest, legitimate traffic. It's Google Chrome running on a Windows desktop from my home IP address. But now I want to try something a little bit more suspicious. And I'm going to do this with the Tor browser. So let me bring that over now. Now Tor is a very popular anonymity service, and it achieves its anonymity by routing requests through layer upon layer of different network segments, thus isolating both the source of the request and, in cases where servers are stood up behind Tor, also anonymizing the destination. Now in our case, we're browsing to a public website, but my source is effectively going to be anonymous. So let's do this. Let's go and load up the website, cloudflareonazure.com. Now this is exactly the same site that we've been loading in Chrome, but now we can see something different. Here is the challenge. So this is Cloudflare saying you must verify that you are a human before you can proceed. And like so many anti-automation challenges, this is a reCAPTCHA. So we're going to have to go down here and actually manually enter that text. So you can see here how unpleasant the user experience is. And it's just as unpleasant as every single time you have to enter a CAPTCHA. The thing here though is that we can't even load the public website until we answer it. And that's because traffic coming in through an anonymizing service like Tor is frankly way more suspicious. And the security level that we have on the firewall means that the threat score of this traffic is sufficient to cause the challenge. So even though we might be browsing this site legitimately, we're going to have to fill out this challenge. But of course, as you can also see, those who are attempting malicious activity, particularly automated malicious activity, against your website are going to be faced with this. And this is going to put automation at an absolute dead stop. Let's complete the challenge and make sure that we can proceed okay. And now we can see from the title on the tab that the page is successfully loading. So this is where you need to exercise a bit of discretion. What is the right level for your audience? Now, most of the time, you're probably not going to be too worried about audiences coming from Tor for most websites. Certainly not unless they're the type of website where people are genuinely going to want to be anonymous. Now, once the challenge has been answered, I can now browse around this website as much as I like and it will work perfectly okay. And how long I can do this for is determined by the timeout on the challenge. So let's jump back to the Cloudflare control panel and I'll show you what I mean. If we now jump into advanced, you'll see that we have a section here on the challenge passage. So this is how long someone can keep browsing around for after they answer that challenge. I've left this on the default of 1 hour. But as you can see here, you can challenge more frequently, which would certainly give you more security. It would be harder, for example, for someone just to simply answer the challenge and then start automating an attack against your site. Or I can extend it longer, because perhaps we do want people legitimately coming from Tor and we want them to be able to then spend some time on the site. I don't want to focus too much on Tor though. That's just one example of where the threat score was increased based on the nature of the traffic. And again, Cloudflare is very clever about determining what is good traffic versus what is potentially bad traffic. Now this really is a pretty rudimentary defense. It's quite basic. And really it's primarily there to stop automated attacks. Now that I have actually answered the challenge in my Tor browser, there's nothing to stop me browsing around and attempting to exploit weaknesses. I could start mounting a SQL injection attack, for example. I've already answered the challenge, so I've got another hour before I have to do it again. So it's very important to keep in mind what this firewall will do for you and what it is not intended to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about the more sophisticated commercial options available in Cloudflare as we proceed through this module. For now though, I want to move on and have a look at access rules. One of the things that we can do with the Cloudflare firewall is configure access rules. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can see what's in here already. And you'll see 5 different records. Now the first one, the IP starting with 137. That's my Azure website. And we can see the action there is that it's been whitelisted. All the other IP addresses, all the 216s, are Google's. And that's going to allow Google to come and crawl the website. Because clearly we do want Google to actually be able to index the content on the site. That's a pretty important SEO feature. What I want to look at now though is the ability to actually apply additional access rules. And there are a couple of different ways we can do this. Now I'm going to jump over here into this box and you'll see here that we can enter an IP range, or a 2-letter country code. And what I'm going to do, just as an example, is I'm going to block AU. So I'm going to block Australia. And I'll leave a little note here to explain what I'm doing. Let's now add that access rule. And what you'll notice here is that you can't actually block an entire country. What we can do though is we can challenge an entire country. So let's do that. We'll change to challenge. We'll add the rule, and if we collapse the warning from before, we'll see it now listed down the bottom. What I want to do now is grab a new tab, we'll go to cloudflareonazure.com, and now we will see the challenge again. So we've just configured this to force anybody coming from Australia to make sure that they aren't a bot. Now how would you use this? Well, a good example would be if you consistently saw malicious traffic coming from one particular country. Now there are various reasons why you might see traffic centered around one single origin country, and it may well be that they don't all adhere to the one IP address or the one subnet. So this ability to actually say, hey, any requests coming from this country are going to need to verify that they are indeed human, this can be quite useful. But as you can see, you'd also want to be very, very cautious with this, because you've got the ability to really make life difficult on everybody coming from an entire nation. So approach this one with caution. Let's now jump back to the firewall. I'm going to delete that rule because I would actually like to be able to access this website from Australia. And this time what I'd like to do is block an IP address. So let's do this. I'm going to grab a new tab. I'm going to go to whatismyipaddress.com. I'm going to obfuscate my IP address because it is my personal address, but I am going to copy it onto the clipboard. I'm going to jump back into the Cloudflare firewall settings, add the IP, set it to block, and then jump into a new tab and load our website. And now we can see access denied. The owner of this website has banned your IP address. So it's pretty explicit as to why you no longer have access. Now this would be really useful if you're seeing constant malicious activity from one IP address. If there's no chance of it being legitimate traffic, then blocking it certainly puts a pretty rapid stop to it. But of course, this is another level altogether on top of the challenge. The traffic simply isn't going to get through. So you do want to be quite selective about how you use this. Consider also that often it will be the same externally facing IP address used by multiple people. So if they all go out through the one corporate gateway at an organization, for example, blocking that one IP because you see some malicious traffic from there could block a whole bunch of legitimate users as well. That may be a case where rather than block, you actually want to make that challenge instead. But fortunately, Cloudflare gives you the tools to decide what degree of defense is appropriate based on each situation. So that's the basic firewall rules. Let's now move on and see how we can apply rules all the way down to the page level. I want to now give you an example of using page rules, and I want to both show you what it does do in terms of defense, as well as what it won't do in terms of the type of attack that it can't stop. So what I want to do is scroll down to the bottom of the page and go into my V12 cylinder layouts. Now that I'm on this page, I want to mount a very basic little SQL injection attack. And in fact, I spent a lot of time doing injection attacks on this page in my ethical hacking SQL injection course. And I'm going to pick one of the attacks from there. It's going to close off this string and then just do an equivalency test to see if a password is equal to the number 1. Now, when I run this attack, what's going to happen is an internal exception raised by the SQL server is going to appear up on the screen, and it's actually divulging one of the passwords from the system, which is this one here, password with a 0 instead of an O. Now, the scenario that I want to paint here is, let's imagine that we know that this page is under attack. So this one right here, cars by cylinders. I'm going to copy that onto the clipboard. And what I'm now going to do is jump back over to Cloudflare and then over to the page rules section here. So this is where in the last module we added this rule to always use HTTPS. So we can see an existing rule there up the top. What I'm going to do now is enter a new URL pattern, which is going to be /, so the root of the site. The page I just copied onto the clipboard, and then anything that comes after that using the star wildcard. Now I'm going to set up a rule to say that this page presently has a security level of I'm under attack, and we're going to add that rule right now. So what we should see now as we scroll back up is the second rule existing here under the one about always using HTTPS. So here's what we're going to do now. I'll go back to the website, I'll go back to the home page, and I want to navigate back around to this V12's page again. Now here we see this. This is the interstitial page. So it's trying to validate that I am making a legitimate request before it forwards me on. So here we go. We're now back on the same page. But here's what I want to point out, and this is a really key thing about what the firewall does and does not do. I'm going to go back up to this URL, and I'm going to enter the same attack as before. So it looks just like this. And here we can see that I get the same internal exception again. So I've actually gotten the password back out of the system. Even though I told Cloudflare that this page is under attack, I can still mount a SQL injection attack. Now here's the important thing to understand about the firewall. It's about defense against the automation of these style of attacks. And what we've just done is made it very difficult for someone to point an automated tool at this resource, but not so difficult that they can't manually mount a SQL injection attack in the browser. Now this is a much harder way of attacking a website, when you've got to manually mount the attack in the browser. But I wanted to show you this to make it really clear that this defense is not intended to be absolutely foolproof. This is clearly a SQL injection attack. The pattern is very SQL injection-like, but the free firewall service in the Cloudflare offering won't stop someone trying to manually enumerate through injection attacks. Now, Cloudflare does have a commercial plan available that includes a genuine web application firewall. It will block attacks like this, and you'll pay for that level of defense, which is fair enough. So the page rules and the general tailoring of the security level is fantastic for defending against these automated sort of attacks. You just need to be clear about how far their capability goes and what sort of attacks will still go through. There's one other feature of the firewall that I want to touch on briefly. So let's jump over into that firewall section again, and we'll scroll down a little bit and look at the Web Application Firewall tab. Now you'll often see this referred to as a WAF. And as I mentioned just before, you can get access to the WAF by upgrading to a pro plan. So going commercial, it's beyond the level of free service. But one thing that you do get with the WAF for free is the browser integrity check. And this is where Cloudflare is going to look at the headers from the visitor to try and help establish whether it's a genuine threat. And as we'll see explained here, this means looking for headers used for things like spammers, bots, crawlers, traffic which doesn't conform to a known good state. Now, as you'll also note here, Cloudflare does point out you want to be a bit cautious with this. You don't want it blocking legitimate requests. So for example, requests to an API. So it is something that you want to use a bit cautiously. But certainly the concept of being able to identify traffic patterns based on whether they're a legitimate browser or not can be a valuable feature to have. But do follow Cloudflare's advice and just be really cautious that it's not causing any false positives. I want to finish up this module by trying to just contextualize what it is that the Cloudflare firewall does and doesn't do all in one location. And one of the things it is very useful with is rejecting crawlers, the nasty kind of crawlers that you don't want crawling your site. So the whole concept of building up a threat score and establishing the legitimacy of the traffic before it hits your site is actually quite valuable. Now to that effect, it's great for stopping automated attacks, and we saw how more suspicious traffic, such as traffic coming from Tor, was prompted with a challenge page. Now challenge pages are great for stopping automation. They can be merely inconvenient for humans, but they put a dead stop to bots. Now Cloudflare also makes it very easy to change that level of threat protection. So we just saw that when we took that one single page and we said, hey, we're under attack, and we got the interstitial page in between the original request and the target page we actually wanted to load. So that was a really useful way of preventing an automated attack specifically against that resource. And that didn't put the whole site on high alert either. It was just that one page. But in terms of the things that Cloudflare's free firewall is not intended to do, we saw things like an attacker still being able to mount a SQL injection attack. Now, whether we put an interstitial page there or a challenge page there first, once the attacker actually goes through to the legitimate page, after being established as a human, there's nothing to stop them manipulating URLs or tampering with parameters or any of the other sorts of things attackers do. The main difference is they're not going to be able to automate it from the outset. They are going to have to go through that manual challenge process. Another thing to be a bit conscious of, and I alluded to this very early on in the course, is that you may well have other domains on the site that aren't going through Cloudflare's protections. So I still have the domain hackyourselffirst.troyhunt.com pointing directly to the Azure website. It doesn't get Cloudflare's SSL and it doesn't get Cloudflare's firewall. If an attacker really wanted to mount automated attacks against this site and circumvent Cloudflare's protection, they could just go straight to that domain. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, as fantastic as the Cloudflare service is, good web security practices are still essential. You do not want to have SQL injection risks in your site, regardless of the level of Cloudflare protection you've got. And that goes for all the other sorts of risks you'd also have in your site. This is another layer of defense, a valuable additional layer of defense, but it doesn't mean taking shortcuts in the underlying app. The good news though is that if you get the security of your app right, the Cloudflare defense on top of that is a great addition to the overall security profile of your site. Let's summarize the module. And the most important message I could possibly give you throughout this module has been about the way Cloudflare's firewall is all around applying the appropriate defense based on the calculated threat. So I talked about threat scores and identifying suspicious behavior, and then deciding what level of defense is provided. allow the traffic through, challenge, interstitial page, or just outright block. All of those are very intelligent, evidence-based decisions made by Cloudflare's firewall. Now, it's also very easy to configure that firewall to respond to specific traffic. So challenge an entire country if you'd like, or just block an individual IP address outright. That can be a really useful feature, and having access to that immediately when you need it is quite powerful. One of the most key messages in this module, though, is that Cloudflare's firewall is fantastic for protecting against automation. It raises the bar and makes attackers jump through hoops that they wouldn't have to if they had access directly to your naked site. But of course, in addition to Cloudflare's defenses, the underlying site security is still so important. This is another layer on top of that, a great layer, but security is all about defense in depth, applying multiple layers to prevent attackers compromising the site. And Cloudflare does a great job of providing one of those layers, and not just providing it, but providing it for free and in a way that you can start using within just a few minutes of configuration. Add to that the fact you can go and get SSL for free right now, very, very good SSL at that I might add, and Cloudflare is clearly excellent value for a fantastic service.